And tonight we're going to talk about Pamela Colman Smith and my book, The Queen of Wands, the story of Pamela Colman Smith, the artist behind the Rider-Waite Tarot Deck, or as you mentioned, many of us call it the Smith deck or the Pamela deck now because of her amazing contribution. And Pamela is maybe somebody you're already a little bit familiar with if you're here, or maybe you're looking to learn something new about her tonight. Either way, I'm really excited to chat all things Pamela. And in fact, yesterday was actually the 1 year anniversary of the publication of this book. So it's really a great time to be here and talk about it. And I'm just very honored and excited to be here with you all. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And so just a little bit about me. Aside, my focus is really on writing and illustrating books, but I do work on lots of different kinds of projects, including comics and editorial work and sometimes branding work. And I've put my email and my Instagram at the top of this slide. I'm always around to talk about art, to answer questions, to talk about Pamela Colman Smith. So don't be shy. Feel free to keep in touch. And yeah, here's just some of my work. I do a lot of comics for the Washington Post, which is this Cats of New York that you see here on the slide. I do lots of like animal and travel comics. And then I do also like to do lots of portraits. Here are some disco queens from the girls from ABBA. So yeah, just a little sample of my work when I'm not working on books. And I also recently illustrated a deck of mantra cards for the same publisher who published The Queen of Wands, which was a really cool project to work on. Each card has a little mantra on it or words of wisdom to inspire you. And it's kind of interesting to work on decks after doing so much research about Pamela Colman Smith, because it's really evident how even 100 years later, we're still kind of inspired by her, and she really changed tarot forever. And even though this is not a tarot deck, it's a mantra deck, I still found myself referring to her drawings and her kind of visual language. And I'm working on a new deck right now with the same author and the same publisher, which will be out in 2024. So I'm sort of building this portfolio of decks and books that are related to tarot, which has been really nice and fulfilling for me the last few years. And I know if you are a customer of Watkins Books and you're here tonight, you probably know a bit about tarot, but just in case anyone's here who is not familiar, because there are a lot of people who've maybe heard of tarot but have not dabbled in it, I just wanted to explain a little bit about the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot Deck. It's the most popular tarot deck in the world. It's often referred to as just the Rider-Waite deck after the publisher Rider and the author Arthur Waite. But Pamela Colman Smith was the artist who created all of the illustrations for these cards, which is what made this tarot deck so impactful. So because of her massive contribution to the evolution of tarot and to this deck, many of us add her name as the title and call it the Smith deck or the Waite-Smith deck, lots of different variations, the Pamela deck. And she was unfortunately forgotten for many years. And it's a pretty recent development that people are starting to acknowledge her work and her contribution to tarot in a real way. I'm really honored to be a part of that movement. So you've probably seen these cards, whether you practice tarot or not. They're some of the most widely recognized images in the world. And this is just a small sampling of the whole deck. And we can sort of reflect on these images that Pamela created while we chat about her. And it's also important to note that although I don't know 100% for sure, it is rumored that Watkins Books was the first shop that sold the Waite-Smith Tarot Deck in the early 1900s. So first they were just available like by order and at trade shows, and then the decks were sold at shops little by little over time, and Watkins is said to be the first one. So that's, a reason why I'm really excited to put this talk together. And I created these special signed Watkins book plates that will be in the cover of every book you buy at Watkins. So if you stop in anytime soon, you can grab a book that has this kind of commemorative illustration that I've signed in the front. So yay for Watkins. Thank you for having been around for so long and doing all the amazing work that you do. So about Pamela, the woman of the hour. I first found out about her almost 10 years ago when I moved to New York City. I actually had my first tarot reading at the time, and the reader explained to me that a woman drew all of the card illustrations, but she was never really credited for her work. And because the tarot deck is so familiar and widely known, I guess I had never really thought about where the art came from. It just kind of felt as if it had been around forever. Um, and I never, thought about the origins of this work. And I'll never forget that reader and this gift of knowledge that he gave me, because it paved the way for this entire project. And actually, I just found out that that shop where I had the tarot reading is closing down, and I'm a bit sad about that. But even more happy that I could kind of memorialize that experience in this way through the book. So here are a couple photos of Pamela. You can see her in all her glory. She was absolutely amazing. And that moment that I learned her name, it sparked this interest in her that I'll probably have for my whole life, which led me to researching and writing about her over the last few years. I then went on to write my graduate school thesis paper about her, and that research later culminated in this book, which Running Press has so beautifully published last September 2022. And in the book, I chronicle Pamela's life story from her birth in England in 1878 throughout her unique childhood, traveling back and forth between London, New York City, and Jamaica, which was so rare for the time for a young woman to be so traveled. Um, all the way to her hanging out with famous actors and artists, to her development into a multi-talented adult who worked as a set designer, a teacher, a writer, a storyteller, and of course, an illustrator. A lot of people, if they do know Pamela's name, they know her for the tarot deck, but actually she created so much. Her body of work was massive. She created children's books, synesthesia paintings, which she would paint to music, watercolor paintings, oil paintings, reportage ink drawings, just a massive amount of work, not to mention her theater work, her set designs, her puppet shows that she would do for kids. She was just such a multifaceted creative person. And the Waite-Smith deck is really only a small fraction of her life's work, but obviously it's a very impactful one. And here are some images of her artwork. You can see a drawing she did of Ellen Terry, the famous Shakespearean actress of the time, on stage here, who was also kind of a caretaker of Pamela when she was a child. And this is a reportage drawing, which means she drew it from life. So she was likely sitting in the audience at a play in which Ellen was starring, and she was drawing in the moment. And anyone who has ever created artwork or drawn from life knows how hard it is to make something that looks good in a short amount of time, and how difficult it is to capture movement in the moment. A lot of us contemporary artists, we rely on photos, right, to depict movement in our figures. And she had this incredible skill of drawing from life and getting down a gesture very quickly. And that actually is what I think contributed to her being able to create the tarot deck in such a short amount of time. She created the entire deck in only 6 months. So when you look at this work from her younger years, a lot of it was from the theater. She was a lover of theater, and she was raised kind of in the theater. And she would just draw and draw and draw and draw, and she developed this reportage incredible skill. And then on the right here is a wonderful calendar that she made depicting Shakespearean heroines. So she was kind of an early feminist, always interested in women and their contribution to the arts. I'm sorry if you hear my naughty dog barking right now. And so in the book, To kind of honor her vast body of work that I mentioned, I ended up picking a different piece of art to base each color palette off of for each chapter of the book. So the colors in the section about the tarot deck, for example, that period of her life in which she was creating the tarot deck, are those colors are inspired by the actual colors that she used for the cards. So in that section, which starts on page 93 of the book, you can see that the color palette might remind you of the tarot colors. I'm holding up some sample pages here, and you can also see on the slide here. And when I was deciding on a format for the book, I really wanted it to be as accessible to readers as possible. Her life story is so rich that you could really write multiple books on her. And there are, in fact, some wonderful, more academic style textbooks about her that chronicle her whole entire career. Um, but for this purpose, I wanted people to be able to sit with it for an evening and leave with an understanding of Pamela. I wanted to make it more simple and more accessible, and I didn't want there to be any more barriers between the public and her legacy. So I decided on this paneled graphic novel format, which could, in theory, be enjoyed by all ages. And as I was going through this process of learning about her and writing, I realized that there's something about Pamela that I really connected to the more I learned about her. And I tried to convey this connection in the book with interludes that talk about my own journey as an artist in relation to her journey, and also how her work connects to modern times. She was really ahead of her time in a lot of ways. She created suffrage artwork and propaganda against the war, and was a wonderful mentor to other women who wanted to become artists. So I was just so inspired by that, and a lot of her values sort of reflect modern values about equality and inclusion. And so, yeah, a little bit more about Pamela. She was born in Middlesex, England, on February 16th, 1878. Her father was a merchant, and so hence that traveling that I mentioned between England, Brooklyn, New York, where both of her parents were from, and Jamaica, where many people believe her mother's ancestors were from. And Pamela was accepted to study art at Pratt Institute in Brooklyn when she was only 15 years old. Pratt, if you're not familiar, is a very prestigious art school that's actually right in my neighborhood in Brooklyn. So being accepted to study there at the young age of 15 as a woman was pretty incredible. And she continued to break down barriers, not only as a woman artist in the early 1900s, trying to make her way, but also likely as a queer person and as a person of color. She never took the easy path, choosing, not to marry a man for financial support, which is what many women did at the time, especially if they wanted to be artists. And instead, she decided to live with her female companion at a time when unconventional lifestyles were, quite frankly, pretty dangerous and not accepted. But despite all of her accomplishments and all of the barriers that she broke down, why is she still so unknown? And I'm really trying to change that with this book and to celebrate not only her vision with the world, but also to talk about the myriad of challenges that she faced. And so she did travel between Brooklyn, England, and Jamaica as a child. And then at the age of 21, she sort of settled down in England. She got an apartment in Battersea Park in London, not too far from where Watkins is. And when she was working on the tarot deck, she completed 80 drawings in just shy of 6 months. That's 80 drawings. And as an artist myself, I can tell you that is absolutely wild. Not only the sheer quantity of work that she did, but when we consider the impact of this deck, it's pretty incredible and how laden with symbolism each card is, the detail, and you can really see that reportage, quick drawing skills coming into play here when she was able to create so much artwork in such a short amount of time. And of course, unfortunately, she was paid less than the equivalent of minimum wage at the time by the man who commissioned her, which is Arthur Edward Waite, even though her work changed the course of tarot forever. And her name was also not even included on the deck. But if you look closely at the cards, you'll see her signature in the lower right-hand corner. So if you look at the moon card that I have here on the slide, in the blue, right above the text where it says the moon, in the right-hand corner in the blue water, you see this kind of flourishy PCS. And then I sort of blew it up here in my illustration on the right. PCS, it stands for Pamela Colman Smith. So that's how she left her mark. And if it weren't for that signature, we might not even know who did this artwork because she was barely mentioned. In the guidebook, I think it said something like, oh, the artwork was completed by a young woman artist, but she was not mentioned by name. So thank you to Pamela for leaving this wonderful signature on each and every card, because otherwise we might still be searching for the artist. So she left her mark in many ways on the deck. And it's also worth noting, like, it's also worth talking about her process, and noting that at this point in history, women did not even have the right to vote, let alone draw from a live nude model in a studio, right? That was forbidden. So she couldn't draw from a live model. They didn't have photography like we do now. So she couldn't rely on photo references. And so she had to be very resourceful when making her deck. So she enlisted her friends to model for her. She even used her own cat as a reference in the Queen of Wands here. You see the little black cat. And she would go out and study the architecture at churches and cemeteries to get her perspective right. So she was just an extremely motivated and hardworking artist, despite how difficult it was, despite all the odds that were against her. And while tarot is a very old practice, and Pamela did not, come up with it or invent these cards in any way, she did dramatically change tarot through her art. Her deck was the first tarot deck on the market that was accessible to the public. Before that, decks were handed down, um, kind of inherited within a family, or you had to be pretty high-ranking member of a secret society like the Order of the Golden Dawn in order to have access to tarot teaching. But this deck was designed to be readily available, something that people could purchase at markets, at shops, at bookstores. And because it also came with a guidebook, customers could actually use the cards on their own, again, rather than having to be a member of a secret society and gain that knowledge through privilege or elitism or class, which is how it was before this deck. They could actually read this book on their own. Anybody who could get that book in their hands could connect the philosophy of tarot to the practice with Pamela's art serving as the guide. And what really set the deck apart is that each card was a powerful scene because she was the first illustrator since 1491 to depict the minor arcana cards with full scenes rather than just symbols. So when I say minor arcana, I mean the cards that are the wands, the cups, the swords, not the major ones like the Empress. So these minor arcana cards are also called pip cards. And prior to Pamela's deck, the pip cards only showed a symbol of the suit. But the scenes that she drew, as you can see here up on the slide, I have the Two of Pentacles, the the Five of Cups and the Three of Swords, um, they kind of contribute to the overall story of the deck. And she believed in a reader's ability to partake in their own ritual with the cards, to interpret the images how they see fit. And she designed the story, or she designed the deck so that a story could be revealed no matter what formations the cards took. So prior to that, there was the Solobuska deck in 1491, which, if you read the book, I go into the history of tarot a little bit more. That deck depicted some of the minor arcana cards with full scenes, but there was a big gap in history between that and Pamela's deck. So her deck really changed the way that people could consume tarot. And you know, if you didn't have a fully fleshed out understanding of what the Five of Cups card means, you could maybe look at her image and intuitively deduct meaning from it. And that's what was so special, and I believe why people still gravitate to this deck today. And in recent years, we have really seen the practice of tarot increase in popularity since the 1970s. There was a big surge in tarot popularity, at least in America, in the 1970s. Then there was a little lull, and then basically the COVID pandemic, Donald Trump's election, lots of different factors kind of boosted the popularity. And also, as younger generations in the US sort of move away from organized religion, alternative practices like tarot and astrology are gaining popularity as ways for people to find meaning in their lives and guidance, spiritual guidance, right? And with this kind of rise in tarot practitioners, there's also a newfound respect for Pamela's work. All you have to do is Google, you know, some images of tarot, and you'll see that there are just so many artists out there who are making their own decks in tribute to the Rider-Smith deck. They're modeling their imagery after Pamela's imagery. And the Rider-Waite-Smith deck still does remain to be the most sold tarot deck in the world. So it's clear that Pamela's, you know, imaginative yet easily digestible drawings have played a very large role in the way that tarot is consumed. And here is just a wonderful painting that she did that is very different from her work on the tarot deck, but nevertheless just as stunning. And I really encourage you, anybody who's interested in Pamela and her work, to research her other artwork because it is absolutely incredible. There is a children's book that she made called Susan and the Mermaid, which I have, that's just so beautiful and magical and detailed. So I implore you to check out her other work as well if you're a fan. And I also wanted to share that, so back to my process a little bit. When I was trying to come up with a title for my book, I was studying the different cards and their meanings. And keep in mind, I am not a tarot reader. I read for myself for fun sometimes, but primarily I am an artist who just really appreciates Pamela's contribution to the world from an art historical perspective, from a female perspective. But I am not a tarot expert by any means. So I was looking through the cards. I was trying to come up with a name for the book and something that I thought fit with Pamela. And when I came across the Queen of Wands card, I was stopped in my tracks because when you pull this card in a reading, it reminds you that you're upbeat, you're courageous, you're determined. You're here to see through your creative visions and your life purpose, even in the face of adversity and challenge. I really couldn't think of a more fitting description of Pamela Colman Smith. So thank you all for being here tonight to celebrate her life and her work. And before we go, I actually wanted to read a little passage from from my new, or before we switch over to questions, I should say, I wanted to read a little passage from my new book that I just finished up. It's coming out next June, and it's called Women of Tarot: An Illustrated History of Divinators, Card Readers, and Mystics. And this book chronicles the history of tarot and four key women who contributed to its evolution over hundreds of years, as well as profiles on nine mystical women from all over the world. And Pamela, of course, is one of these women. Here's an illustration from the book. And I'm going to take a sip of water and then read a little passage about from Pamela's section. So, by the time she had turned 21, Smith had decided to permanently relocate to London, only traveling back to New York for special opportunities. It was a bold undertaking to make such a move alone, as a young woman without financial support from her family, and with the intent of building an artistic career. Her father passed away shortly thereafter, leaving Smith parentless, yet motivated to build her own community. Many of the close friends she hosted at weekly parties during this time would later become famous creatives, including the Irish poet William Butler Yeats, the American painter Alpheus Cole, and the English writer Arthur Ransome. During a period made more difficult by grief and financial struggle, Smith also began to truly develop her identity as an artist and a storyteller. She attracted interesting people and built a hub for them in her home. Around the time that she moved back to England, Smith also began to explore occult studies. Perhaps she did so to make sense of the loss of her parents, or just to find a spiritual outlet during an uncertain time. She joined her friend William Butler Yeats in becoming a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn in 1902. The time Pamela spent with the organization deeply impacted her artwork. She began to channel her occult studies into her paintings and performances, connecting with the supernatural world of mysticism. She would create illustrations for the Occult Review, a publication about all things mystic, where she met fellow Golden Dawn member Arthur Edward Waite. Several years into her studies, Waite invited her to collaborate on a new tarot deck he was developing, known today as the Rider-Waite-Smith Deck. So this book will be on pre-order next month. So if you follow me and keep in touch, join my newsletter, I'll be notifying people about it when it's available. So thank you. That is my portion about Pamela and myself. And now I just wanted to leave some time to hear any comments that you might have or any questions. Yeah, that's a great call out, all of that. So yeah, first you mentioned Alfred Stieglitz, which many people know Georgia O'Keeffe. It's one of those rare moments where the wife is a little more famous than the husband. Georgia O'Keeffe, the brilliant artist, her husband Alfred Stieglitz was a photographer and owned a gallery in New York City, and he showed an exhibition of Pamela's work. And yes, she wrote to him after she finished the deck with her famous words, "Hey Alfred, like, have you sold any of my paintings? I want some money for Christmas. I just finished this huge project, a very big project for very little cash," were her famous words. So that was her kind of announcing that she had done the tarot deck, and which is incredible because she obviously put so much thought and intuition and insight into this deck. But then in the end, it was just, anyone who's an artist knows that sometimes you do these projects, they don't really pay. You're like, oh, I hope that turns into something good, but I don't really know. And that's how she kind of announced it to the world, a very big job for a very little cash. And yeah, she was complaining in that letter that the cards would be printed probably very poorly. And you're exactly right. So she studied at Pratt, and she um, had a very high affinity for Japanese woodblock printing, and you can see that in a lot of her work with these thick lines and the color, how it's sort of inset like a litho. And I actually studied printmaking in college, so it's another reason why I love to look at Pamela's work. but she painted them. So she did not print them herself. So she created paintings, but she kind of always kept that bold line work with the inlaid color, that sort of technique that she took from Japanese print block printing, and painted that way. So I believe she would paint with watercolor and then do ink lines over top. And unfortunately, as far as I understand, the first printing was very poor, and actually the backs of the cards like peeled off. And that's one of the reasons why the deck didn't really become popular in her lifetime. So it was very flimsy and it didn't really take off. And then there was kind of like a recall for that first edition. So I don't think like anybody, as far as I know, I don't think the first edition like exists anywhere. I think that they all just sort of disintegrated and fell to bits. And then years later, they reprinted the deck, higher quality printing paper and inks, and that's, you know, closer to what the decks look like today that we have. I see some questions here. Cats, yeah, that Pamela's cat was named Snuffles, as far as we know. And I mentioned in the book, I put a little disclaimer, you know, everything we know about her, we think is true. Like a lot of it is taken from her personal letters and her diaries. And she also kept this incredible guest book in her apartment where she would throw these parlor parties and have all these creatives that became the famous Shakespearean actors and writers and artists of the time. They were all her friends, and they would come and hang out, and they would sign her guest book and draw little pictures in it and write. And so Stuart Kaplan, who was the director of US Games Inc., which is the printer of the Rider-Waite-Smith Tarot Deck, he did such a massive deep dive into her life and read through all of her letters and kind of personal ephemera, and sort of found these tidbits. And so things like, oh, her cat Snuffles, like that's where we get that from. And he's wrote some incredible books. So if you're interested, I can put his name in the chat. And if you are interested in ephemera the way that I am, you will absolutely love his work, because he's actually scanned and reprinted her letters and photos and drawings. And oh, the famous parties were in London. They were in her Battersea apartment, to answer Jennifer's question. Peggy asks, was there an image in particular of Pamela's from the deck that really speaks to you? I absolutely love the star card. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. This female figure pouring out of a water vessel into the ground, and it's sort of the cyclical, beautiful, natural scene. I think it's so powerful. I come back to it all the time. And I also had a baby 10 months ago, and after that, I don't know, the divine kind of feminine imagery really speaks to me. So that's my favorite. Yeah, there she is. So she's pouring from both into the well and then into the ground. I read it as kind of nourishing the earth and the cycle of life. And I love that card. I also like the magician. I think there's so much mystery to the magician. Aura asks, what from her life story suggests that Pamela Coleman Smith is queer? So she never married a man, which, okay, great. A lot of people don't, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're queer, but she did live with a female companion named Nora Lake for decades. And she eventually moved out of London to the Lizard Peninsula in Cornwall, which one day I would absolutely love to visit. And she had a house there with Nora, and in her will, when she passed away, her greatest wish was that Nora would inherit her estate. She also acted as Nora's caretaker, and she was very close friends with some openly queer um, people, artists, creatives at the time, and they would kind of in rebellion do things like wear pants and smoke cigarettes and hang out together and be kind of open about their unconventional lifestyle. So Ellen Terry, who was this famous Shakespearean actor, her daughter Edith Craig was one of these women who was an outspoken lesbian, and I believe that her and Pamela I may have had more than a friendship, not sure, but there are several cards in the deck that are clearly modeled after Edie. And so yeah, so that's why I always say probably queer or as far as we know, we don't know for sure, mostly because queer people at this time were repressed and could not, necessarily be open about their sexuality. But her lifestyle does indicate to a lot of historians and scholars that she probably was not heterosexual. So, yeah, the building in the moon card, is that Battersea? Oh, that's a great question. I don't know. It absolutely could be. This is why I would really love to travel. I've been to Europe many times, but never to England. And I really would love to see some of these places in person and investigate. Also, unfortunately, her burial site is not known because when she passed away, she did. Thank you, Hugh. She did have so much accumulated debt that unfortunately her wish of her estate being left to Nora Lake could not be carried out because it was sort of seized by the state to pay off her debt and her back taxes, and then she could not afford a proper burial, essentially. So her burial place is unknown, and Stuart Kaplan did a lot of investigating into trying to find it because we have some death certificates and some indications that it may have been in Bude, um, but no like confirmed evidence. So if anybody out there is like a sleuth and has connections to the parish and Bude and has any inkling, I think this is probably something that people are going to look into for a very long time and try to uncover so that we can honor her, in a physical way as well. Um, Martha says, I went to Cornwall this month, both Blizzard and Bude. The places are beautiful. There's a small mention of her in the Castle Museum, and one of the symphony paintings is on display at Tate in St. Ives. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I also wish she was celebrated here. There's also, I don't know if we have any participants from the States or if any of you travel here, but in Connecticut, a few hours from New York City, there is a castle called Gillette Castle. And Gillette, I'm blanking on his first name right now. I believe it was William Gillette, was a cousin of Pamela's who became also a very successful Shakespearean actor. And he has a massive estate in Connecticut, and actually her paintings are on display there because he seemed to be one family member who actually was very supportive of her and was one of her patrons and bought her work. So that's also something that's like not really publicly celebrated or promoted. But if you go there and you can get a tour of the castle, you can see her paintings in person, which and like I was saying, that's a little bit special because we don't have like the original tarot artwork. We don't really have a lot of her original work in general. But we have this sort of random location with some of her work in Connecticut. But that's wonderful that there's a mention of her in the Castle Museum. And Hugh, do you know about Watkins being the first shop to sell the deck? I'm not sure. Yeah, and I'm not positive if if it would have been that original defective issue, or if it would have been the reprint, which would have been a few years after, maybe like 1915 or something. But that would be such a cool project to go back and find. You need a good intern for that. Yeah, Martha says she goes to the British she went to the British Museum to study the Solabuska deck, so I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, good point. Um, what connects you with Pamela as a woman illustrator? And also, are you planning to make a book for Frida Harris as well? Oh, okay, that's a great question. I mean, what connects me with Pamela as a woman illustrator? I mean, being an illustrator is can be really tough work, right? Like it's an unconventional lifestyle. I did once have a 9 to 5. Well, for many, many years, I had many different 9 to 5s, and sort of taking the plunge into exploring your own work and trying to create it with the world and hoping that other people will connect to it. I mean, I think that that's just um, a common effort that many artists will connect to and understand. Um, and as a woman, it's so much better today, but obviously we still face a lot of the same issues of condescension and doubt from the world, from men living in a patriarchal society. I think somebody asked previously a question that I didn't get to. They asked, "How do you think the collaboration with Arthur Waite went?" And that's a really loaded question because, of course, it birthed this deck like that we all love and know. So it was successful. It was important. It was magical, right? Um, but at the same time, Arthur is kind of on record. We have letters of him saying like, "Oh, this artist, she was kind of a dummy, and I had to sort of spoon feed her this information." And she was a member of the Order of the Golden Dawn, which was one of the few secret societies that allowed women members. However, she wasn't allowed to go to the like classes and workshops that the upper elite members, aka the men, could go to. So Arthur would kind of have access to these libraries, these archives where the history of tarot and older tarot decks were treated like hidden treasure that the gods had gifted to these men. And she was only lucky enough to have him relay this information to her. She couldn't access it herself. So she was kind of in a position of inferiority, sorry, from the beginning, of submission, where she had to rely on him to kind of give her this information. She would synthesize it and create the cards, which, is even more incredible when we look at the artwork and how she created her own interpretations. Um, so I don't experience that kind of misogyny in my daily life, but of course I have experienced some, and it just makes me respect her all the more for being kind of the fierce, resilient artist that she was. Um, so yeah, that's how I connect to her. I also connect to her because, like I said, I studied printmaking in university, and so did she. And oh, you ask, am I planning to make a book for Frida Harris as well? So my new book, that I read the passage from, Women of Tarot, Frida is one of those 4 key women that kind of changed the evolution of tarot. So if you're not familiar, Lady Frida Harris, created the Thoth deck with Aleister Crowley, that controversial person, and he's quite the character. And Pamela is another one, Rachel Pollack, who was a wonderful tarot expert and author. She actually just passed away a few months ago here in upstate New York. She's one of the women. And then Marie-Anne Lenormand, who was the first celebrity kind of fortune teller in Paris. And the Lenormand deck was created in her homage. So those are the 4 main women. Lady Frida Harris is one of them. And then I include lots of other mystics, divinators, psychics, etc., spiritualists from all across history in the world. Um, and yes, I did connect to her work. I have to say, I do connect with Pamela's story and Pamela's artwork more than the Thoughts deck. However, Lady Frida Harris's contribution and achievement is nothing to sneeze at. Her work was incredible, and she actually created full-scale oil paintings that then became the inspiration for the deck. And I think that a really interesting dynamic to note is that Pamela was an impoverished artist, right? And she, like I said, relied on Arthur Waite to help her out with this information of tarot and to pay her. And Lady Frida Harris, she has a lady title. She was a noblewoman, and her relationship with Aleister Crowley was kind of uh, switched. So she was the patron of that project. She enabled him to create this deck, and she was in a bit more of a position of power to create the artwork that she wanted to create, and to get people to buy it and to keep it alive. So I think their difference in dynamic of what it meant to be a woman artist at this time is really, really interesting. And I go into that a little bit in the book, which, like I said, is going to be available for pre-order next month, and then it comes out the following June. How can I connect to you both as I found this wonderful webinar purely by chance? Oh, thank you, Michelle. That's very sweet. I'm going to put my Instagram and my email in the chat here, and I would love to stay in touch with anyone who ever wants to talk about this stuff. Reese asks, Pamela's companion Nora was known to be a spiritualist. Do you think Pamela still done reading with her cards? I'm wondering if you mean, did she do readings for Nora? If that's, oh, probably. I would hope so. I like to think of them having their own little special sanctuary of occultism and mysticism in the lizard there. I don't know for sure. There's really not much known about their relationship other than that they lived together and that Nora was a spiritualist. She also suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder from the war, and Pamela was her caretaker. Other than that, we don't know too much. And there was sort of an emotional shift in Pamela's life. As I mentioned, she was really outgoing. She was a social butterfly. She had all these cool friends in London, and she had this iconic guest book, which has given us so much knowledge and information about her life and about who she was hanging out with and when and how her work was developing. And then one day, she wrote in the book that she did not care for people anymore. And she gave the book away and she moved to the lizard. And at that point, that kind of pivotal point in her life story, we don't really know much about. We know some books that she published, some things that she worked on, but we don't really know what was going on with her, like emotionally. We do know that she converted to Catholicism and that she lived with Nora and that she had a few failed kind of financial investments. But we don't know, like, she didn't write letters to her friends about Nora or about their relationship. So a lot of it is kind of a mystery. Maybe one day we'll find more. I hope so. Oh, that's such a good question. I mean, illustration has been kind of left out of the canon of art history for a very long time. And I think that that is a bigger problem in and of itself. But I do think that it's getting a little bit better. And actually, the Whitney Museum of American Art here in New York City had a show of modernist work last year, and they actually had the Rider-Waite deck on display. So again, not that original deck that fell apart, but I think the one after. And in addition, they had some of her watercolor paintings on the walls, and it was, like, such an amazing moment because it's, like, finally she's being included, among the likes of Georgia O'Keeffe, all these other modernist painters, and I think more of that. I think her like you said, her synesthesia paintings were absolutely incredible and so strange and different, and, her synesthesia was um a real neurodivergence that she dealt with. So sometimes she would hear sounds and see horrible images in her mind, and other times she would hear sounds and see beautiful scenes. And so this artwork that she created from this sort of burden slash superpower that she carried around with her are so incredible. And I think it was Claude Debussy who said, "Oh, you've imagined my work better than I could have myself." Um, so those paintings, I understand that tarot is its own kind of separate category of art and within the illustration world, and I understand if that's not going to continue to be seen in museums and stuff because it's niche, right? But these paintings that she made, especially the synesthesia ones, I think do belong in museums and art history books, and I hope that she continues to kind of get her due and be seen as more than just the deck, even though we celebrate it. Like we said, she said, "Oh, it was a really big job that, you know, kind of a pain in the ass that I barely got paid for." So that wasn't all she wanted to be remembered by. She was so multifaceted. So that is my hope for her, that we continue to celebrate the deck and its achievements, but also recognize the, the myriad of other work that she created. I think that's really interesting, and it's funny, actually, I got coffee this morning with a friend of mine who's an illustrator, and she just started working on her own tarot deck, which, like you said, a lot of people are doing. They're exploring that world, and, she was saying something like, "Yeah, I really don't know if I wanna make something new or if I wanna make, more traditional tarot, or if I wanna copy the tarot cards and make them my own." And I said, "Oh, by tarot, do you mean Rider-Waite?" And she was like, "Yeah, of course." And I realized that that deck is really synonymous with tarot. Like, when people think of the specific cards and the symbols, they don't really think that there are any other options. And what an incredible achievement. Like, I don't know what else you could, compare that to. It's like, it has to be the most widely distributed piece of illustration of all time. I can't think of anything else that has been reproduced in that way that even people who don't really know what it is could maybe recognize it. Um, so I think that, yeah, most decks that are created today are created based on the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Um, I think it's a way. I'm actually working on an actual tarot deck right now as well, and I think that it can be a really wonderful way for an artist to kind of explore the limits of their abilities and to connect with themselves through learning about the cards. So I'm studying right now with a tarot expert to actually learn more about tarot, and about the history of each card and how they're connected, before I kind of start making the art. And I think that that is just such um, a really amazing investigative project that any person can take on. And there have been a lot of people who aren't necessarily artists throughout history that have made their own tarot decks. Like, well, I mean, Salvador Dali obviously was an artist, but not that kind of art, not an illustrator, and he made his own tarot deck. And Rachel Pollack was a writer, and she drew her deck, and her drawings are famously naive because she wasn't a skilled trained artist, but they're absolutely incredible. Um, so I think that it's something that people will probably continue to explore forever. And I see Martha has a question here. I've noticed leaves as a common illustration in the story, leaves floating in the air, just wondering why. Um, I like this question. I realize sometimes that um, people can't read my mind and that I should share some of these little tidbits. But here in Brooklyn, we have a lot of sycamore trees, and especially on the Pratt University campus, it's full of sycamores, and it's kind of this very iconic environment. And the leaves falling in the autumn is really beautiful sight. And I like to think that Pamela saw, those same trees that I see now all the time walking around in my neighborhood. And so that was my little nod to her and kind of this shared geographical thing that we have in common. But also, I think sometimes when I think about Pamela, I think she may have been a little bit of an ungrounded person. I think she was maybe searching. She tried out a lot of different spiritual paths and a lot of different art forms. Even though I think that's what's incredible about her, I think she was searching a little bit for her place and for respect and for um, you know, for credit and admiration and finding herself a little bit. And then at the end of the book, when she passes away, the leaf falls to the ground because she can rest. She's not being blown in different directions anymore. She kind of is able to settle. Um, Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I like to try to imagine what it was, what it looked like from her perspective sitting at her table drawing. I'm someone who finds a lot of joy in mundane things. I think uh, the glass that someone chooses to drink out of tells a lot about themselves and gives a lot of information, so I'm kind of a nerd for the small details in life, and it was really fun for me to sort of imagine what those details would have been like for her, especially because we have photos of her, we know what she looks like, but only a couple. There's only like, I don't know, 5 to 10 like actual photos of her. So, um, also to keep visual interest too. I could keep redrawing the same scene over and over, or I could try to imagine what her world would have looked like and bring the reader into that world. It's coming out June 24th. It'll be, or sorry, June 2024. And it'll be available for pre-order next month. So, yes, I hope to be back for round two for that book as well. Well, thank you so, so much. Thank you, everybody, for attending. This was really an honor.